All right, let's get going here. So this is our last topic before the first midterm. So just as a reminder, the first midterm is the Monday that we come back from reading week. So yeah, that day you come into class, you write it in class. It is written, like you do complete it on eClass, but you do it here, and it'll be password locked, and I have to provide you with the password so that you're able to get into it. So you won't be able to do it remotely unless you're, a student with accommodations, in which case I will get in touch with you next week and outline how you write it. But it's basically just online using SEM. It's nothing fancy or difficult. The exam is really straightforward. It's 30 multiple choice question, 4 short answer questions, 2 of which are kind of terminological or definitional, right? So they're concepts, and then 2 which are essentially practical questions. So something, to the effect of, I'll give you a scenario, some kind of little story, and you write me a research question or operationalize variables or write survey questions or whatever horrors I come up with next week while I have spare time on my hands. So yeah, it's really, like I said, I think it's a really straightforward exam. Like I said, 30 multiple choice, 4 short answer. 2 of them are, definitions or terms or concepts, and 2 are kind of applied. So I think it's pretty easy. Any questions before? Yeah, go ahead. So technically that is next class, yes, but I guess it's a whole week and a bit away because we have reading week starting next week, and then Monday, yeah, it's the Monday after you come back from reading week. So, yes.
Would it be possible to get some sample
questions? Fine. No. Okay. Yes, I have them. I think I just have to turn them loose. But yes, that's fine. I don't mean, I'm joking in my disdain. Famously, I hate practice questions, but I will make some available for you in the next couple of days here. I had them last term, so it should be easy enough for me to do it again. Other questions? Everyone loves practice questions. Other questions? Nothing? Okay. Well, I don't think this will take the whole class because it's structured observation. It's a relatively short unit. It's just another form of quantitative research, and it's pretty straightforward. There's not a ton to say about it, so however long we take, we take. Before I start, one other thing I should say. So the Monday, I guess I can send this out on eClass. I'll just say it anyway. So Monday is the exam. On the Tuesday, there's no lab, but I will be in my office during the lab times if you want to drop by and get help with the major lab, which is going to be due a few days after that. So if you have, most of the work done or some of the work done and you want to run it by me or get some advice, I'll be in my office, and I think I'll probably get Joe to hang out in that room. And if you want to go talk to him, you can talk to him as well. Okay, but I'll send out an email to that effect later. All right, structured observation. My brain is a little tired at the moment, but I'll get through this. And again, it's pretty straightforward, so I doubt it's going to take the whole class. Okay, so for quantitative researchers, right, survey research is generally the one that people use. That said, we've talked about some of the problems with survey research, and structured observation is a way of trying to basically get another quantitative method for looking at how people act, right? So, obviously, we talked about some of the problems with surveys, variations in the interpretation of key terms, right? You misunderstand questions, memory problems or false memories or misremembrance, social desirability bias, people answer how they think you want, embarrassing questions or threatening questions that may lead to non-response or false answers. And yeah, the inconsistencies between stated and actual behaviors, right? Which is essentially kind of like social desirability bias. So one of the ways that people suggest you can ultimately get around this is to observe behavior directly, right? Rather than trust people and their recollections and how they answer surveys or do things in structured interviews, you observe their behavior, in person directly and kind of go from there. Okay, so structured observation is a little bit different than some of the qualitative methods. Like, it shares some features with some of the qualitative methods like participant observation, but because it's quantitative, it's much more, I think, limited in its scope and rigorous in the way that it's structured. So generally speaking, right, you have explicit rules for observing, categorizing, and recording behaviors. It is based on direct observations, right? So typically, if you're doing structured observation, you are physically present in a research site, actually observing people, either overtly or covertly. It depends on the kind of research you're doing. But rather than relying on the reports people give, you would actually be in the space. Now, that said, obviously, access to research sites can be difficult. People, knowing that they're being observed might feel very uncomfortable. And almost always, like, generalizability is going to be a problem with structured observation because your samples, it's very time consuming. Your sample size is generally going to end up being much smaller than you would with even, a rudimentary survey where you're getting 100 people is going to be bigger than most structured observations because they are so dreadfully time consuming to do. And yeah, generally the way that it works is the rules for observation and recording data are contained in what's called the observation schedule, which is basically, a kind of a guide to how you observe particular behaviors. Okay. This is one kind of particular example of one observation schedule that came from a study from Bales. And so it's a 1951 study, so it's a rather old one. But basically, it was a look at small group interaction processes. It was for an imaginary study that basically Bales proposed, but never actually did. And so this would be basically, you would, sit in a small group and kind of score each interaction. And I think this one was in 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, you noted what was happening on a kind of a chart, and you kind of judged people's interactions based on this, right? So you have here 12 codes, right? Helps, rewards, affirms others, tension, releases jokes, shows satisfaction. You can read them. I don't have to read them to you. And basically, the values are tabulated, and a score is given, right? So sum of 13, balancing tasks, areas are needed. There's a neutral affect, so the person being observed would be kind of neutral. And then, sum of over 13, or sum of 13, depending on how these are scored. Social emotional reactions were kind of judged in different ways. Anyway, this is a weird one, but basically what Bales was suggesting is that you could observe small group interactions and sort of see how people were interacting with each other. And here he said that based on the score you came up with, you could tabulate what their management or leadership style was. Okay, so this is basically what the kind of coding sheet for Bales' study would look like, in theory, if you actually did it, right? So basically, each of these blocks represents a 15-second increment. So at every 15 seconds, basically, Bales would, in theory, or the researcher would make a quick note as to what they were seeing. If they're observing someone, say the manager in a particular social interaction, okay, the first 15 seconds, you have a timer that goes, and you note that at the first 15-second instrument asks orientation for repetition, or asks orientation or for repetition or clarification, right? So they do that for 30 seconds, and then the next 30 seconds is gives orientation, repeats, clarifies, right? So basically, you're cataloging in a structured observation what people are doing in any particular moment in an interaction. So, and then you tabulate all of this together, using scoring criteria, and you get, essentially a kind of sense of someone's leadership style. I think where, you don't see structured observation very often. It's very time consuming. It's a little bit hard to, put together a comprehensive observation schedule. So it's not a terribly popular research methodology. Sometimes you see these sorts of things with like observations of playgrounds, right? Where someone will go onto a playground and they're looking at how kids interact with each other, and they'll make notes, again, at increments, what's happening. I've seen people do not operating rooms, ERs, right? Where they'll, go into an ER and just sit there and note what is going on, like what different people are doing with this kind of observation schedule to get, kind of objective sense of how people behave in emergency rooms. So, like I said, not a terribly popular method, and it's pretty, I don't know, my opinion, it's pretty dull stuff. It has pretty limited use, but basically it's to try and get a sense of behaviors in a space where you have access to in a very objective way, trying to quantify kind of human interactions in a very objective way. Now, one of the real challenges, I think, is that if you're coming up with obviously it's a 12-point schedule for what you can put in terms of different kinds of observations. Any kind of observation schedule is supposed to be exhaustive, right? So it's supposed to have any kind of behavior that you could observe. So sometimes either the categories have to be really vague, like big and vague, or you have a ton of codes and the whole thing can get quite unwieldy. All right, how are we? Does that all kind of make sense? Okay. So yeah, other types of observation research are mostly qualitative, right? So we'll talk about, when we get to after the midterm, we'll look essentially all at qualitative methods. But things like participant observation, right? And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the course, I think, or did I do that in SOC 100? I can't remember anymore. I think I talked about participant observation. And participant observation is a little bit different in that basically it is meant to immerse yourself in a particular social setting for extended periods of time, right? You go and hang out with gang members, or you go, I'm thinking of only extreme examples, but you observe a movie set and what happens on a movie set to determine essentially why people are doing the things they do, how they interpret things. Almost always something like participant observation gets mixed with interviews as well to get a deeper sense and not just observe people's behavior. But that is another kind of observational research at the end of the day. Non-participant or unobtrusive observations. Basically a type of ethnographic research, essentially where a person, instead of, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about qualitative methods, instead of participating directly in a social situation. So let's say, okay, here, we'll go back to our favorite example, mine and yours. You're already smiling. I know you know what's coming. The furries, right? So if you want to understand what's happening with furries, right? One of your choices might be participant observation, right? You put on your furry suit, or you go to the furry convention with your name tag that says Joan, furry researcher. I'm picking on you, I'm sorry. That would be the best title, furry researcher. I think my favorite title for a researcher I ever saw was chief futurologist, which is apparently a position at Ford Motor Company. They have a chief futurologist who's basically a sociologist that tries to predict the future, but furry researcher would also be a decent title. So you go and you basically like walk around the furry convention, you interact with furries, and you make observations about what is happening, right? So yeah, they may or may not know that they're being observed. It can be either overt or covert, but that is basically a participant observation. Non-participant observation, observers don't take part in the activities, right? So let's say that you were wanting to observe furries. Maybe okay, this is gonna sound creepy, but I'll say it anyway. You get CCTV camera footage of the furry convention, right? Or you're watching the furry convention from the security booth at the, Sheraton Hotel where they're meeting. for the Edmonton Furry Fest or whatever it happens to be. And you just kind of observe them without them knowing. Or sometimes they might know, sometimes they might not. You could just sit there, sometimes a non-participant observation. You might just be sitting back, right? Maybe you're observing the furries just from a chair in the corner. And they may or may not know that you're there. They may or may not know why you're there. But the important thing in a non-participant observation, you're not interacting with people, right? You're just there to observe. And yeah, I mean, the process can be structured or unstructured. I think most of the time, like you could do a structured observation, of say the furries. You have a schedule to look at different interactions that you see from your position, or more commonly, I think people do unstructured, where you just kind of try and take in as much as possible and make notes. Yeah, John.
What about non-participant observations when they don't know they're being observed?
It would depend on the space, right? So if you're in a public or quasi-public space, you sort of have to assume that your actions might be observed, right? So like if you're at a convention, right? You don't necessarily have an expectation that what you do there is going to be private. There's security cameras observing you. There might be other people, theoretically observing you that you either know or don't know about. And so in that case, it's probably relatively fair and ethical, because it's like, well, people know that this isn't a private space. Changes completely if you start, observing people in what they presume to be a private space. Then obviously the ethics becomes much more questionable, which is why like some of the weird research that was done, observing gay men in truck stops or whatever, right? Truck stop bathrooms or something. There were these studies done in like the 1970s where they didn't know they were being observed and they sort of assumed these were private spaces or bathhouses, right? Those were probably unethical and would get knocked out by research ethics today. But in the past, research ethics wasn't what it was at the moment. So I think public spaces is fine because there's no expectation that what you're doing is private. Anything that verges on a private space, it becomes a bigger question, and you'd have to get it past research ethics, and you'd have to make a strong case for why people shouldn't know that you're there and how you're going to protect their privacy too. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, so unstructured observations, again, I think is more typical of qualitative research. Generally, there's no rules for observing or recording your observations. Typically what people do is they make field notes, right? Either in real time or after the event, as close as possible. And again, we'll talk about field notes when we talk about qualitative research. And basically, you're just trying to gather as much detail as possible, make thorough notes, and develop a kind of story as to what is going on. But this is, most participant observation is unstructured. You don't see a lot of structured observation. Okay. So how do you, that looks very good on my screen and very small on that one. Hang on. My classic in the middle of class redesign. Can I make that bigger? Let's make that bigger. There we go. That'll be a little easier. Okay, much easier. So what do you need to do to create an observation schedule? Okay, so you need a clear statement of the problem. You need a research question. What is it that you're trying to observe? What is it that you're trying to find out through your structured observation? Your observation schedule needs to basically figure out who is being observed and which behaviors are being recorded, right? So if you go back to that one from Bales has a very clear idea of who they're looking at, right? They're looking at people in leadership positions, in small group interactions, and what kind of behaviors they want to observe, their interactions with subordinates. Okay, so this is the really hard one, and the one that I think probably makes structured observation the most difficult is the third one here. Categories for recording behavior must be mutually exclusive, and they have to be exhaustive. So, basically what this means is the categories can't overlap, right? You don't want to have where you're in a situation where you're like, oh, I guess that one is a 7 and a 1. Right? That's not how structured observation is supposed to work in your 15-second increment. You want it to be mutually exclusive so that every single kind of thing that people could do is somehow different. It categorized differently so that you can have a really clear understanding when you're looking back on it what was happening in that time. So that's hard enough, right, to make sure there's no overlap and no ambiguity, obviously because people's behavior in social situations can be really complex. And mutually, so it has to be exhaustive. So there can't be any, you sort of have a bad schedule if, you look at a, say in Bales' example, a 15-second block, and you're like, I don't know what I just saw. There's no code in my observation schedule for this. You can't really have that. That's going to cause you problems. It means that you haven't built the categories out well enough. So typically, what people will try to do is pilot studies to set up, you come up with your initial idea of your interview, or sorry, not your interview schedule. And you can tell I'm a qualitative researcher, of your observation schedule, and you try to develop, codes, and you try to see if there are any question marks, right, or any ambiguities, any overlaps, and then you refine your codes. So this is going to look a lot like when we get to qualitative research. When you need to code interview data, often you have these sorts of codes as well, and they also need to be, exhaustive and mutually exclusive. It can be a bit of a process, and it takes quite a bit of time. So along with being, because it's not hard enough to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive, the classification scheme has to be clear and easy to use. This is especially important if you have more than one person doing structured observations as part of a study. Right, basically, everybody should be able to use the tool to make the observations, and it should be relatively easy. Otherwise, you're going to get a ton of inter-interviewer, or inter-observer in this case, rather, inter-observer variability. And that's going to shoot your whole thing, the validity completely, I was going to say, it'll flush it down the toilet, we'll put it that way. And yeah, I mean, the idea behind this kind of observation is you're doing this very quickly, right? 15-second or 30-second increments, or even 1-minute increments are not very long. So you need minimal interpretation of behavior. It's just kind of on the surface, right? You can't be doing deep dives into people's psychology, almost from a pop psychology sort of point of view. It has to be very minimalistic so that you can do it very quickly. Okay. Okay. So some of the ways that this can be done, and again, you can do a few different ways. The one that Bale suggests is essentially, this one is a kind of time sampling. So, basically you observe interactions that take place in designated intervals of time. Bale's had 15 seconds. You could do every 15 minutes for 3 hours, right? You can essentially set this up any way you want. You can record incidents, right? Hopefully you can see that okay. Wait until there's a behavior of interest and then record it. So say if you went into, I don't know, an emergency room. Or no, hey, let's go back to the furry convention. Let's go back to the furry convention because it's fun, I think, hopefully. And you wanted to see how often there is like a sexualized behavior at a furry convention. You could wait until there's a behavior of interest and then mark it down, make observations about it, and then kind of wait for the next one to occur. Or in an ER, right? If people get aggressive with the triage nurses because they've been waiting a long time, you could you observe only that particular kind of incident because that, you're interested in incidences of aggression towards triage nurses in ERs. So you basically find a behavior you want to look at. You have, you're going to record what happens once that behavior begins. And every time one starts, then you kind of go and make your observations. Time periods, right? So basically you observe something at kind of set intervals in designated periods of time, right? So you want to see how people interact in the food court downtown, as they go for lunch. And you go into the food court and you make these observations every day at from 11:30 till noon, right? So these are kind of different kind of intervals that you can do something like a structured observation. Sorry, is that all? Is that all making sense so far? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, compared to survey research, what do you get? Why would people want to potentially do this? It is much more time consuming and much more difficult, as I think you can see, but you would get more reliable information about events, right? Because you as the researcher are observing them directly. So rather than relying on other people's accounts of what happened at a specific time or how they dealt with, waiting in an ER for a long time, you're observing it directly, right? You have greater precision, obviously, regarding the duration and frequency of events. You get around people's memory problems, right? You have to be there to observe it, but definitely you have, you can time things and you'll have a greater kind of sense of exactly what happened, the duration, the frequency of particular kind of events, how often someone was dismissive of a subordinate in a meeting, how often people got upset with triage nurses on a Saturday night at the Misericordia Hospital, and how long and how, basically the triage nurses talked them down or whatever it is you want to observe. You can you can time order events more accurately. One of the problems, if you've ever certainly talked to people, asked them in an interview or on a survey to say what happened in any particular order, people's memories get pretty jumbly, and people may misremember, in what order events happened. So like large-scale social episodes, if you are observing them, right, if you're observing the furry convention, you can generally more accurately reconstruct what happened because you have a bunch of observations, that are very detailed as to what happened using a very scientific kind of method. So, ooh, that was loud. Always with reliability. Inter-observer, right? So, inter and intra-observer reliability or consistency are issues. How, if you have 2 different people or 10 different people or 15 different people all doing structured observations, how consistent are they in how they are observing things, right? An intra-observer, like from one time to the next, how consistent is one person in using the tool? And both of these things, like, inter-observer, obviously you have different people, they may perceive things in slightly different ways. They may perceive, apathy or, sexualized behavior in different ways. So with your schedule, you have to be really clear, and usually training is the solution. The intra-observer one, I think, is probably harder to fix with training. Because one of the things that's probably going to be an issue in some structured observations, especially if someone is doing it for relatively long periods of time, is fatigue, right? Let's say you're wanting to observe, an ER on a busy Saturday night. As you go on, as the night gets longer, you might get less consistent about it. You're more tired. You may start to miss things. So that can be a bigger problem. Usually with inter-observer consistencies, basically what you do is you train people on the tools, you role play, until people are really, really comfortable with the tools. And then you send them out in the field, maybe have them do a pilot study, and then fix any problems you find in the tool to make sure things are being used really consistently. Sometimes having the training might involve having 2 people or 3 people do the same observation together, right? To make sure that they're doing everything consistently and any member of your team knows how the tool is being used, and you can, look at a video of something happening and try to use the tool. And then, go back, compare everybody's results, and then see why people were interpreting things differently and fix that through training. Okay. So reliability is an issue, right? Because people may not be measuring the same thing in the same way all the time. Validity can also be an issue with structured observation. Are you measuring what so validity again is principally, are you measuring what you're hoping to measure, right? Let's say that you're setting up Bales's, looking at leadership style based on these kind of interactions between people in authority and subordinate people. Well, what if it just so happened, that what you're seeing is not this person's leadership style, but they were fighting with their wife that morning or their husband or whatever, and so they're in a bit of a bad mood. And so what you're recording, you think is someone with poor leadership style, but actually you're just dealing with, a particular moment for a particular person. Are you measuring things correctly? Is your tool set up, like even if you think about something like leadership style, which is a bit of a nebulous term, are you measuring leadership style or are you measuring something else with the tool that you have? So there can be, real questions about how valid a particular tool is at assessing a certain behavior. And because you're trying to break things down so objectively, it can be really, really difficult. You have to do it properly. Obviously, variations in how tools are administered can be big problems as well. Things have to be done properly, and especially within teams, everybody has to be on the same page, right? Everybody has to be using the tools in the same way. And then reactive effects, right, is probably one of the toughest ones, and in effect would affect validity in major ways. If, say you're assessing someone's leadership style, right, and you're sitting there taking notes and putting your numbers into little boxes every 15 seconds, they might very well change their behavior because they know that you are there, right? So if you're in a situation where you're doing the observations and people know why you're there, what you're doing, that may very well change the way that they behave. And then obviously you're not measuring leadership style, you're measuring leadership style when being observed, right? And that ends up being a slightly different phenomenon. Yeah, and I mean, sometimes researchers will say that as you spend more time, as the researcher spends more time with participants, you've been hanging out at the furry convention for 3 days, people stop noticing that you're there. So sometimes, people will suggest that you need to be present for a long time in a particular observation scenario or a site in order to get people accustomed to you being there. You can't just walk in on day one and be like, I'm going to be observing your leadership style, here we go, because people are immediately going to be in that reactive state. But once you've been sitting there for a week or so, they might stop noticing that you're there and be less conscious, maybe only conscious of what you're doing part of the time. So an acclimatization process might be, part of what you have to do this kind of research. Okay, so this is well known. The guinea pig, or it's brightening the lights. And basically, one of the weird things that happened is the workers all knew that something was going on, right? Because they knew management was trying a bunch of stuff. The interpretation that the workers had was that the management was trying to make their lives better, was trying to make work better. And also that they were being observed. So everybody wanted to make sure that they looked as good as possible. So what happened is no matter what management did at this electrical plant, or this electric works, building something, no matter what they did, people worked harder and productivity rose. And at one point, famously in the Hawthorne study, they had the lights dimmed so far that the workers could barely see what they were doing. And yet they still worked harder at the end of the day because it was like, well, there must be doing something to help us and I don't want to seem ungrateful. So they worked even harder, though they could barely see. And the conclusion of kind of the Hawthorne study was, when people basically think that you are trying to help them or trying to improve their working conditions or generally just observing them, they will work harder so as A, not to appear lazy, and B, because they kind of want to help you, find out what makes their lives better. So oftentimes, that reactivity can actually completely mess with your results. Okay. Role selection, right? So participants can adopt an expertise role when asked questions or shift to a more passive role than usual. Sometimes what'll happen, obviously, is in order to kind of make themselves seem more important, or maybe to show you that they're in charge, there can be all sorts of ways that this happens, right? People might adopt, more active or more passive roles. maybe just knowing that you're observing them, someone may not want to take part in anything. So while they might have been like the most gregarious person in meetings, they just shut down while you're there, right? So that's a reactive effect. Or they pipe up because they want to look good to their boss because they know that you're there observing them, right? So they adopt different roles, things that would be different than usual. That looks like a spam call. Okay. It could be a survey. They'll leave a message if it's a survey. It's probably, windows and doors again. Or my Visa card has been charged on an iPhone 13 on Amazon. It's happened like 5 times this week. Not really. Oh, they did leave me a voicemail. Okay. No worries. I'll check it after. So, the researcher, the other thing that can happen, obviously, it's a researcher being there basically can cause change, right? The physical environment is changed when a new person arrives. And so people might start behaving differently. People might clam up because, now you're suddenly in the lunchroom with them, observing their interactions, and they don't want to speak freely. So, before you were there, they were all talking about, how Nancy in accounting is sleeping with Ted from management. When they're there, it's like, yeah, that was a pretty great Super Bowl show with Taylor Swift and stuff. I know she wasn't in the Super Bowl show. I didn't watch the Super Bowl because I don't care. But right, people's whole behavior might change by you being there, right? You actually alter the environment by making what's normally a comfortable environment seem weird, and so people change their whole behavior, and they don't talk about Nancy and Ted having their affair anymore. Okay, yeah, trying to be helpful to the researcher. This happens, right? Sometimes people want, they actually want to help you, and so instead of just acting normally, they try to give you what you want. So they join the experiment wholeheartedly. Sometimes even if you haven't told them what you're looking for, they try to anticipate what you're looking for and give you more of it, right? So, the manager in our imagined scenario with Bales, thinks that you want to find how empathetic and managers are. So they really pour on the empathy because they think that's what you're looking for, right? Sometimes they might ask for approval afterwards. Like, was that what you were looking for? How's that, right? Did you get what you needed? Yeah. Did you get what you needed is a phrase you'll hear a lot in these sorts of things. So yeah, it only matters if it impacts the actual phenomenon being studied, but it can definitely cause a sort of reactive effect. Varied reactions according to who the researcher is. Physical appearance can matter a lot. What people look like, how they're being perceived, all of these sorts of things. I know one of the things that we're not talking about sort of structured observation, we're talking about structured interviews, but one of the concerns that I know my boss addressed with a lot of the grad students, especially the female grad students that were going in and giving structured interviews to prisoners, was that in the past she's had people that try to get people to open up by flirting, and basically like flirting with this particular population caused all of the results to go completely out the window, right? All of a sudden you're getting wild stories and bravado and machismo out the doors. So she has the system a little bit more. So it's it'd be better if I got some sleeves to go do prison research, but I'm afraid of needles, so it's never going to happen. I don't want to be poked repeatedly by a tattoo artist. Vary how people react to you in particular circumstances. Okay. How many slides do I have left here? A couple. Okay. Field experiments, right, sometimes can be done as, so that's basically where you go out and you kind of observe people in the, it's an experiment. I talked about the subway violinist experiment, and piano stairs are famous ones. These would be kind of field experiments that people have done to see how people, react in a kind of natural setting. So, and basically what people have done in those cases is essentially a structured observation, right, where they see how people react to the subway violinist in his different garbs, or they see how people react when the stairs they usually walk on up the subway stairs start playing notes as they walk over them, right? You can do a kind of structured observation as a field experiment. Yeah. Yeah, researchers engage in social interaction in a natural environment, watches what happens, right? That's kind of more like the subway violinist. And typically the participants are not aware they're being studied, so it has to be done in a public place. In the extreme, right, researchers take on a role and use deception to gain entry into social spaces that you couldn't get into otherwise. Now, this is super unethical, right? Going into spaces that you wouldn't have had access to otherwise, and using deception has a ton of ethical problems, could lead to safety issues for you as the researcher too. But sometimes the other problem is that you have limited opportunity for recording data, so you can't implement a coding system, and you end up doing sort of unstructured observation, right? If you busted into the biker gang bar, because you found a oh my God, I'm coming up with wild scenarios. A Hell's Angels jacket at Value Village, and you went and hung out at the biker bar in Edmonton, and you were trying to do observation, right? You having your notebook out and making observations every 15 seconds is going to draw a lot of attention. In this case, probably get you killed, because they don't tend to like narcs or observers that much. So, generally speaking, can be dangerous, and you will have limited opportunities to record data if you're kind of, get in there in an illegitimate way. Okay. Yeah, structured observation, it has its limits, right? Oh, sorry. Yes, Caitlin, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Kind of a weird question, but is it considered more like ethical when a cop does it? Like when people are like narcs and like going to the biker bar on purpose or whatever, right? Like we kind of give them like a social pass to do things like that, but is there a reason why like that gets sort of like a more positive reputation than if you were just a researcher?
I think the purpose is obviously different. Obviously one is for like public safety and public order, and to try and obviously catch people who are criminals. The other one, and again, my example, it might be a little bit over the top. You could have other circumstances where, say, you go into I'm thinking like the things people did in like bathhouses in San Francisco in the 1970s to observe the, behaviors of gay men, right? And almost like turn them into an object of inquiry. The biker example might not be a perfect one. I just kind of came up with it on the fly. In that case, police are obviously doing a different task, right? They're public safety, whereas you're there just for kind of research interest, and your role is different, and your ethical obligations are different than the police too. Like your role is to not harm your participants. Their role is to maintain public safety and order and stop crime. So I think that's why we tend to see it differently. But even in another circumstance, like you're observing a population that may not want to be observed, but you've used kind of deception to get in there, right? I can't, like I said, I think of like the San Francisco bathhouses where people actually went in and posed as gay men to get access to those spaces to catalog behaviors in them. Obviously, those were spaces that people were treating as private and didn't want observed. So yeah, kind of unethical to go into those spaces and be making observations when people haven't consented. I think the key is that for research, we're supposed to get the consent of our participants, and the police have other constraints, right, in terms of the legality of what they're going to bring as evidence. Does that answer your question?
I guess. Like it's an answer. It's not a good.
It's not one that makes you happy.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how. I mean, they're different kind of scenarios, right? And researchers and police play different roles in society. So one is obviously lionized for different reasons, right? Because it tends to be seen as, ultimately for the good of society, and one is, I think, just it's research. So you've got.
Research not like for the good of society though, or like.
It depends. I mean, it depends what kind of research you're doing. Sometimes it's just to advance knowledge as well, and it's a different kind of benefit to society. Where generally, and I'm not saying that this is correct, but the general perception of the police is that they keep people safe, right? And that's what they're doing in those circumstances. Whereas research is more, inquisitive to better understand the world, and there are different ethical obligations. And again, police operate basically based on, rules set out by the legal system as to what they can do and what spaces they can be in, and how what they gather there is used, say in a court of law. But it's a slightly different scenario. I don't know. That might not make you. You might not like the answer. That's the best one I have because I haven't given it a ton of deep thought. But that's my off the cuff kind of answer to your question. Yeah, Joan.
What is you as a social researcher become a police officer? So you could do the arrest for semi.
So you're a researcher and you want to become a cop so that you could, I'm pretty sure, I don't know. You've created a wild scenario. If we could get the Ark of the Covenant in there as well, maybe that would, I don't want to be dismissive of your question. I'm pretty sure that the police would not tolerate that and that you would be violating a bunch of codes of the police as well in order to do that. Yeah, that's what I mean. Which role are you playing and how are you executing either of those roles? How would you actually do that? So, but yeah, it's an interesting question in theory land. Have I ever told? I think I did tell you these like technical legal questions. I always find I'm like, I don't know, probably bad. That person probably gets convicted. I don't know. What was I saying? I don't know anymore. This has taken longer than I thought it would. Because I think, I got 2 slides left, I think. Okay. Sometimes observation schedules might only work in a particular circumstance and setting, right? And often they have to be redesigned for specific settings. Unstructured observation done in advance can help eliminate this and develop a better schedule, right? So sometimes it's like a 2-step process. Because it's so quantitative and those categories tend to be really broad and you're not supposed to put in a lot of interpretation, what people are doing and what you're observing is easy to misinterpret. Yeah, the context of behaviors don't get significant enough attention, right? Because you're making these notes about like face was blank or, told joke, reassured, without kind of understanding the context that things are happening in. It produces small bits of data, right? Like you see how small those numbers are in each of those boxes. Not physically, right? But you're getting little chunks of data about little pieces of time that might actually be hard to tell a story about at the end of the day. I made this way too small. Emergency redesign. I swear these look amazing. I can read this perfectly on my screen, but you cannot read it on yours at all, or on the big screen at all. Okay. There we go. Okay. However, right, structured observation, when all you're talking about is overt behavior, what's out in the public, it can be more accurate and effective than asking people on surveys. And it can work really well when, accompanied by a method that probes the reasons behind people's behaviors. So here, if you use some kind of mixed method, especially if you went into, say, like a qualitative interview to kind of better understand what was happening during, say, a meeting or, at the furry convention or wherever it happens to be, ultimately, when it's paired with something else, it can be effective at times. Like I said, that's the end of the content for midterm 1. You don't see a lot of structured observation. You don't see a ton of structured, I'm trying to make you all happy by giving you a smiley face. You don't see a ton of structured observation. It's rare that I've read about them, but it definitely is a quantitative methodology that people have used. Okay, so that is it. That's all. That's everything up to midterm 1. You now have a week and a half to study for the midterm. So it's like the nicest I've ever been to anyone. Usually it's like a weekend. So you have time. I will hang out until everyone's gone. Other than that, have a great reading week. If you have any questions over reading week, do shoot me an email. And remember, the midterm is, on Monday, coming back from the break. In this room, you have to come. It's written on a device, so you do have to type. So probably a laptop or an iPad with a keyboard is going to be preferable. You can use any device you want, but obviously a phone, it might be hard to write paragraphs or sentences on for the 4 short answer questions. And again, 30 multiple choice, 4 short answer questions. I'm going to be standing at the back, keeping an eye on what's going on people's screens to make sure no one's using Chat GPT or whatever nonsense you use to defeat us now as academics. So All right, have a great reading week. Like I said, I'm here, and if you want to talk to me or send me an email over the break, I'm not going anywhere. There you go. Self-portrait, yes. I was going to draw glasses until I realized I got LASIK 3 years ago. So,
Thank you, Steve.
yeah, we'll see you. I guess we'll see you on Friday, probably.
You have to read it.